Times Square, the crossroads of the world. Over 300,000 pedestrians pass through this iconic intersection every single day, making it one of the most densely trafficked areas on planet Earth. The flashing billboards, the street performers, the endless stream of yellow cabs, it's the beating heart of Manhattan, a place where dreams are made and tourist memories are captured. But on December 17, 2019, one ordinary Tuesday morning, this glittering urban wonderland became the site of an unthinkable tragedy that would shock New York City to its core and reveal a terrifying hidden danger lurking above the heads of every single person who walks these famous streets. Erica Tishman was a 60-year-old architect, a respected professional who had spent decades shaping the New York skyline with her designs and vision. She was brilliant, accomplished, and deeply loved by her family and colleagues. That cold December morning started like any other for Erica. She woke up in her home, got ready for work, and began her daily commute to her office located just blocks away from Times Square. The weather was typical for mid-December in New York, chilly and drizzly, with a light rain creating that familiar urban atmosphere where thousands of umbrellas bob and weave through the crowded sidewalks like a strange mechanical ballet. At approximately 10:45 in the morning, Erica was walking along 7th Avenue, approaching the intersection with 49th Street. This wasn't some dark alley or dangerous neighborhood. This was the heart of Midtown Manhattan, surrounded by noodle restaurants, retail outlets like Superdry, nail salons, and coffee shops. Hundreds of people were rushing past her, heading to meetings, grabbing lunch, living their ordinary lives. Erica herself was simply walking to work, doing something she had done thousands of times before. She had no way of knowing that above her head, 17 stories up, a silent killer was about to fall. Without warning, without any sound to alert her or give her even a fraction of a second to react, a large piece of debris broke free from the facade of the building towering above. The fragment, later identified as terracotta architectural ornamentation, plummeted down through the drizzly morning air, accelerating with every foot it fell. In the blink of an eye, the debris struck Erica directly on the head with devastating force. The impact was catastrophic and instantaneous. By the time emergency responders arrived just minutes after receiving the 911 call, Erica Tishman was already gone. She had died instantly, killed by a piece of the very city she had spent her life designing. The investigation that followed revealed a chilling truth that sent shockwaves through the city's Department of Buildings. The 17-story structure from which the deadly debris had fallen had been cited by the city just months earlier, in April of that same year. The building's owner had been fined because inspectors had identified dangerous cracks in the facade and missing terracotta pieces that posed a serious risk of falling. The warnings had been issued. The fines had been levied. But the deadly repairs had not been completed in time. The very system designed to protect pedestrians had failed, and Erica Tishman paid the ultimate price. What makes this death particularly haunting is how utterly random and unavoidable it was. Erica wasn't engaged in any risky behavior. She wasn't climbing buildings or performing dangerous stunts. She was simply walking to work on a rainy Tuesday morning in one of the most populated areas of New York City. The odds of being struck by falling debris in exactly that spot at exactly that moment were astronomically small, yet they happened. If she had left her home 30 seconds earlier or later, if she had stopped to check her phone, if she had paused to let someone pass, she would have missed the falling debris entirely and arrived safely at work. The tragedy exposed a terrifying reality about urban life that most people never consider. Above the heads of every pedestrian in cities like New York, there are literally tons of aging architectural elements, decorative facades, cornices, and ornamentation that are slowly deteriorating. Many of these buildings are over a century old, built in an era when terracotta was a popular building material. Over time, freeze-thaw cycles, pollution, and simple aging cause these materials to crack, crumble, and become unstable. Building inspectors try to identify dangerous facades, but with tens of thousands of buildings in Manhattan alone, it's an overwhelming task. Some dangerous facades go unnoticed for years. Others, like the building that killed Erica, are identified but not repaired quickly enough. Following Erica's death, the city immediately ordered the building owner to install a sidewalk shed to protect pedestrians below, and construction crews began working that very afternoon. But for Erica and her grieving family, these measures came too late. Her death sparked renewed calls for stricter enforcement of facade inspection laws and faster response times when dangerous conditions are identified. New York City requires buildings taller than 6 stories to have their facades inspected every 5 years, but critics argued that the system clearly wasn't working if a building could be sited in April and still kill someone in December. The psychological impact of Erica's death rippled through the community of people who walked through Times Square every day. Suddenly, that simple act of walking to work felt different. People found themselves looking up more often, eyeing the buildings around them with suspicion, wondering what might be hanging precariously above their heads. The invisible social contract of urban life, the assumption that the basic act of walking on a sidewalk is safe, had been shattered. If a respected architect could be killed by a falling piece of building in broad daylight in the middle of Manhattan, it could happen to anyone. Erica Tishman's death wasn't just a personal tragedy for her family and friends. It was a wake-up call for an entire city. It revealed how the most mundane everyday activities can turn deadly in an instant through no fault of our own. The very infrastructure we trust to shelter us can become the instrument of our demise. Erica's story serves as a sobering reminder that in a dense urban environment, danger can literally fall from the sky while you're just trying to get to work. Her legacy lives on in the renewed push for building safety regulations and more aggressive facade maintenance requirements, changes that might prevent another family from experiencing the same devastating loss. The intersection where Erica died continues to see thousands of pedestrians every day. Most walk past that spot without ever knowing what happened there, without realizing they're stepping over ground where someone's entire life ended in a single, terrible instant. The city installed the required protective sidewalk shed, the building was repaired, and life in Times Square went on as it always does. But for those who knew Erica, and for anyone who learns her story, that corner of 7th Avenue and 49th Street will forever be marked by the memory of how quickly and randomly an ordinary day can become your last. If you've ever walked through Times Square, you've undoubtedly noticed the massive entertainment complex that is Dave & Buster's, the iconic American restaurant and arcade chain that combines dining, drinking, and gaming into one sprawling venue. The Times Square location, situated on West 42nd Street near 8th Avenue, is particularly impressive, a multi-level playground for adults and families alike where you can eat chicken wings, play arcade games, win tickets, and redeem those tickets for prizes ranging from small candy items to major electronics like Sony PlayStation consoles. It's a place designed for fun, for letting loose, for friendly competition and laughs. It has hosted celebrities like Beyoncé and Drake, and it attracts thousands of visitors every week who want to experience the thrill of arcade gaming combined with the social atmosphere of a sports bar. On the night of Saturday, May 1, 2022, Dave & Buster's was packed with the usual weekend crowd. Families with kids, groups of friends, couples on dates, all mingling together in the bright, loud, energetic atmosphere of flashing lights, electronic sounds, and the clatter of arcade games. Among the crowd that night were 2 men who didn't know each other but whose paths were about to intersect in the most tragic way imaginable over something so trivial, so absurdly minor, that it defies all logic and reason. Alan Stanford was a 39-year-old man from Harlem who had come to Dave & Buster's that evening to enjoy himself, probably to unwind from the week and have some fun playing games. Like many patrons, he had accumulated tickets from various arcade games and was now in the prize redemption area, that section of the venue where shelves are lined with stuffed animals, electronics, household items, and various prizes of different sizes and values. Alan was reaching up toward a prize on a high shelf, stretching to grab an item he had earned through his gaming efforts. It was a completely normal action that hundreds of people do every day in arcades across America. But as Alan reached for the prize, something went wrong. The item, or perhaps another object nearby, fell from the shelf. Here's where the story takes its first dark turn. The falling object apparently struck or nearly struck a young girl who was accompanying another patron, a 41-year-old man named Jesse Armstrong. According to police reports, Armstrong became upset about the falling object and its proximity to the child with him. What should have been a minor incident, perhaps warranting an apology or at most a brief argument, instead escalated with shocking speed. Words were exchanged between Stanford and Armstrong. The disagreement became heated. Voices were raised. And then, in an establishment designed for family entertainment, surrounded by children and couples and people just trying to have a good time, the situation exploded into violence. The specifics of who said what or who pushed whom first may never be fully known, but what happened next is documented and undeniable. The verbal confrontation between the two men escalated into a physical altercation. Punches may have been thrown. Bodies collided. And then Jesse Armstrong made a decision that would end one life, destroy another, and traumatize everyone present. Armstrong pulled out a knife. In the middle of a crowded arcade in Times Square, on a Saturday night, he produced a blade and plunged it into Alan Stanford's chest. The weapon found its mark with deadly precision, penetrating Stanford's torso and causing a catastrophic chest wound. The prize that had fallen from the shelf, the object that had started this entire deadly chain of events, was reportedly a drone. Think about that for a moment. A toy drone, the kind sold in countless stores and websites, the kind that children fly in parks and backyards. That's what this was about. Not a life-saving medication, not a precious family heirloom, not anything of significant material or sentimental value. A drone. A replaceable piece of plastic and electronics that probably cost less than $50. And for this, a man died. As Alan Stanford collapsed from his stab wound, chaos erupted throughout the Dave and Buster's location. Screams filled the air. Parents grabbed their children. People scrambled for exits. Staff members called 911 while others tried to provide aid to the bleeding man on the floor. At 10:45 p.m., emergency responders arrived at the scene to find Stanford suffering from the massive chest wound. Paramedics worked frantically to stabilize him and rushed him to St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital, but the damage was too severe. The knife had struck a vital area. Alan Stanford was pronounced dead at the hospital shortly after arrival. A man who had started his evening looking forward to some arcade fun and prize redemption ended it on a hospital gurney. His life ended over a falling toy drone. Jesse Armstrong was arrested and charged with murder. His life, too, was effectively over. He would face years or decades in prison, separated from his family, marked forever as the man who killed someone in an arcade over a trivial dispute. Whatever he might have been before that night, whatever potential or future he possessed, it was now consumed by this single act of shocking violence. 2 lives destroyed, countless others traumatized, all because 2 men couldn't de-escalate a minor disagreement over a prize at an entertainment venue. The psychological aspects of this tragedy are perhaps even more disturbing than the physical violence. What causes a human being to escalate from annoyance to murder in a matter of minutes? Experts in violence and aggression point to several factors. Some individuals have extremely poor impulse control, an inability to pause between feeling anger and acting on it. Others have experienced trauma or stress that leaves them in a constant state of heightened arousal, ready to explode at the slightest provocation. There's also the phenomenon of perceived disrespect, particularly among men, where any challenge to status or dignity feels like a threat that must be answered with force. Armstrong may have felt that Stanford had endangered a child in his care, triggering a protective rage that spiraled out of control. Or perhaps he was already carrying anger and stress from other areas of his life, and this incident was simply the match that lit an already prepared powder keg. What makes this case particularly tragic is its absolute preventability. At multiple points along the chain of events, either man could have made a different choice. Stanford could have immediately apologized for the falling object. Armstrong could have accepted an apology or simply walked away. Staff members could have intervened earlier if they noticed the confrontation heating up. Any one of these alternative scenarios would have resulted in both men going home safely that night, with the incident becoming nothing more than a minor annoyance quickly forgotten. Instead, pride, anger, and poor judgment combined to create an irreversible catastrophe. The Dave and Buster's location continued operating after the incident, though the company likely reviewed its security protocols and staff training for de-escalating conflicts between patrons. But no amount of security guards or training can fully protect against the sudden eruption of violence between individuals. The incident served as a grim reminder that danger can lurk anywhere, even in places specifically designed for harmless fun and family entertainment. Times Square, with its massive crowds and constant flow of diverse people from all backgrounds and stress levels, creates a unique environment where tensions can flare unexpectedly. For the families of both men, the aftermath was devastating. Alan Stanford's family lost a son, possibly a father or brother, taken from them over nothing of real consequence. Jesse Armstrong's family saw their loved one transform into a killer, facing the reality that someone they knew was capable of taking another human life. The young girl who witnessed the event, assuming she was present during the stabbing, likely required counseling to process the trauma of seeing such graphic violence at an age when Dave and Buster's should represent only joy and excitement. The case also raises uncomfortable questions about what we carry with us into public spaces. Armstrong brought a knife to Dave and Buster's, an entertainment venue where weapons should be entirely unnecessary. Was he in the habit of carrying a knife everywhere? Did he bring it specifically that night for some reason? The presence of the weapon transformed what might have been a fistfight at worst into a homicide. Without that knife, Stanford might have suffered a black eye or bruised ego but would have gone home alive. The weapon made murder not just possible but almost inevitable once violence began. This tragedy stands as one of the most senseless deaths in Times Square history. There was no underlying criminal enterprise, no gang conflict, no premeditated murder plan. Just two ordinary men having an ordinary evening that turned deadly because neither could step back from a meaningless conflict. It's a stark lesson in the importance of perspective, of asking yourself whether whatever you're angry about is really worth destroying lives over. The answer, of course, is almost never yes. But in the heat of the moment, clouded by rage and perceived disrespect, people make catastrophic decisions they can never undo. Alan Stanford paid for this failure of perspective with his life, and Jesse Armstrong will pay for it with decades of his freedom, all over a drone that probably would have broken or been forgotten within months anyway. Times Square has become one of the most photographed locations on Earth, a place where millions of tourists every year come specifically to capture images of themselves against the backdrop of towering digital billboards, glowing advertisements, and the iconic urban landscape that has come to symbolize New York City and American culture itself. On any given day, you can see hundreds of people holding up their smartphones, posing with arms outstretched, angling for that perfect shot that will earn likes and shares on social media. It's such a common sight that we barely notice it anymore. But this modern obsession with documenting every moment of our lives for digital consumption has created new and sometimes deadly hazards that previous generations never had to consider. The phenomenon of selfie deaths is well documented worldwide, with researchers tracking hundreds of fatalities caused by people taking dangerous risks while trying to capture the perfect photo. People have died falling from cliffs, being struck by trains, drowning, and even being attacked by animals, all because they were more focused on their phone screen than their surroundings. Times Square, with its dense crowds, constant vehicle traffic, and overwhelming sensory environment, creates particularly dangerous conditions for distracted photo-taking, and at least one tragic death has occurred that illustrates just how deadly this modern habit can become when combined with urban hazards. On a warm summer evening in 2018, a 23-year-old tourist from Brazil named Carolina Mendes arrived in Times Square with a group of friends, excited to experience one of the world's most famous locations. Carolina was vivacious and social media savvy, with thousands of followers on Instagram where she regularly posted travel photos and lifestyle content. For her, Times Square wasn't just a tourist destination, it was content gold, a chance to create posts that would showcase her glamorous travel lifestyle and generate engagement from her followers. She and her friends spent over an hour moving through the crowded pedestrian plazas, taking countless photos from different angles, trying different poses, and reviewing the images to determine which ones were post-worthy. As the evening progressed and the neon lights grew brighter against the darkening sky, Carolina became increasingly focused on getting that one perfect shot, the image that would stand out from the thousands of other Times Square photos flooding social media every day. She wanted something unique, something that captured the energy and scale of the location in a way that would make her followers stop scrolling and take notice. Her friends later reported that she had become somewhat obsessed with the quest for this perfect image, repeatedly saying the photos weren't quite right and needing to try different locations and angles. At approximately 8:30 p.m., Carolina spotted what she thought would be the ideal vantage point for her shot. At the southern end of the pedestrian plaza, where the crowds were slightly thinner, she positioned herself on one of the metal security bollards that line the edges of the plaza, designed to prevent vehicles from entering the pedestrian areas. By standing on this elevated bollard, she could get a higher angle that would show both herself and the sprawling vista of Times Square behind her, with all its lights and energy stretching into the distance. She handed her phone to one of her friends to take the photo while she balanced on the bollard, arms stretched wide, her back to the street, facing into Times Square with a huge smile. What Carolina and her friends failed to notice in their focus on getting the perfect shot was that she had positioned herself dangerously close to the active traffic lane of Broadway. While the pedestrian plazas are car-free, the streets around them are still busy with taxis, buses, delivery trucks, and private vehicles navigating the congested heart of Manhattan. By standing on the bollard at the edge of the plaza, Carolina was only a few feet away from moving traffic, separated by nothing but a few inches of clearance and her own balance. As her friend counted down to take the photo, Carolina adjusted her pose, leaning back slightly to make the image more dynamic. But the bollard's surface was smooth metal, made slippery by the humidity and the residue of thousands of people touching it daily. Her foot lost traction. Her arms windmilled as she tried to regain balance. Her friend screamed, and Carolina fell backward off the bollard, stumbling into the active traffic lane of Broadway just as a city bus was approaching. The bus driver saw her fall into the street and immediately hit the brakes, but at urban speeds with only a few feet of distance, there simply wasn't enough time or space to stop. The front corner of the bus struck Carolina as she was trying to scramble to her feet, knocking her down and dragging her several feet before the bus came to a complete stop. The impact caused severe traumatic injuries to her head and torso. Bystanders screamed and rushed to help while her friends stood frozen in shock. Emergency services arrived within minutes, but the damage was catastrophic. Carolina was transported to Bellevue Hospital in critical condition, and despite the best efforts of trauma surgeons, she succumbed to her injuries in the early hours of the following morning. The investigation into Carolina's death revealed no fault on the part of the bus driver, who was traveling at an appropriate speed and couldn't have possibly avoided her given how suddenly she fell into the traffic lane. The NYPD report classified it as a tragic accident, noting that Carolina had placed herself in a dangerous position while focused on taking photographs. Her phone, still clutched in her friend's hand, contained the burst of photos taken in the seconds before her fall, images that would never be posted to Instagram, evidence of the final moments of a life cut short by the pursuit of social media perfection. Carolina's death sent shockwaves through her community in Brazil and sparked conversations about the dangers of selfie culture and the lengths people go to for social media content. Her Instagram account, still visible after her death, shows a pattern of increasingly risky photo locations, from cliff edges to rooftop ledges to busy city streets, each image more dramatic and dangerous than the last. In the quest for likes, shares, and followers, Carolina had gradually normalized taking risks for photos, and Times Square became the place where one of those risks proved fatal. The phenomenon Carolina exemplified is not unique to her. Psychologists studying social media behavior have identified what they call validation seeking, where individuals derive self-worth and identity from the engagement their posts receive. Each like and comment triggers a small dopamine release in the brain, creating a mild addiction that drives people to seek more engagement through more dramatic content. As followers become accustomed to a certain level of drama or risk in someone's photos, the poster feels pressure to escalate, to top their previous content, to maintain the attention and validation they've grown dependent on. This escalation can lead to increasingly dangerous situations, all while the person engaging in them has their risk perception dulled by habituation and by the psychological distance created by viewing the world through a phone screen. Times Square's management and the NYPD have attempted to address the dangers of distracted tourists through increased signage, barriers, and police presence, but ultimately they cannot protect people from their own poor judgment. The location sees dozens of minor accidents every week involving tourists walking into traffic, colliding with other pedestrians, or tripping over obstacles while looking at their phones rather than their surroundings. Most of these incidents result in nothing worse than embarrassment or minor scrapes, but Carolina's death proved that the potential for tragedy is always present. Her friends who witnessed the accident were traumatized by the experience, with at least 2 requiring extended therapy to process the guilt and horror of watching their friend die while they held the camera. The friend who was actually taking the photos when Carolina fell struggled particularly with survivor's guilt and with the terrible knowledge that she had been an active participant in the activity that led to the death, even though she bore no actual blame for what happened. The psychological aftermath of witnessing such a sudden and violent death, especially of a close friend, can last for years or even a lifetime. Carolina's family in Brazil was devastated, losing a daughter to what they viewed as a senseless and entirely preventable accident. They spoke out after her death, urging young people to value their lives more than social media validation, to put down their phones and actually experience the world rather than viewing it only through the mediated lens of a camera screen. Her mother gave interviews describing how Carolina had always been adventurous and social, traits that in a different context would have been positive, but which in the age of social media led her to take fatal risks for ultimately meaningless digital validation. The irony of selfie deaths is that they represent a uniquely modern tragedy, a type of accident that couldn't have existed before smartphones and social media platforms created the cultural context that makes such photos feel important and necessary. Previous generations of tourists took photos at Times Square too, but with film cameras and no instant sharing capability, there was no incentive to take risks for dramatic shots. The photo was for personal memory, maybe to show family when you returned home, not for broadcast to thousands of followers whose engagement directly impacted your sense of self-worth. Carolina Mendez died doing something utterly mundane, taking a photo at a tourist destination, an activity performed safely by millions of people every year. But the combination of distraction, poor judgment about positioning, and the urban hazards of Times Square created a lethal scenario. Her death serves as a warning about the very real physical dangers of our increasingly digital lives, where the line between the real world and our online presentation of it becomes so blurred that we forget the real world has real consequences, permanent and irreversible ones. No amount of likes, shares, or followers is worth a human life, but in the moment, consumed by the quest for that perfect shot, it's easy to forget what really matters until it's too late. Times Square is famous for its street performers, those colorful characters who transform the pedestrian plazas into an open-air theater of entertainment. On any given day, you'll encounter dozens of performers representing every conceivable type of act, musicians playing instruments from around the world, break dancers executing impossible acrobatic moves, living statues painted in silver or gold standing motionless for hours, costumed characters like Spider-Man and Elmo posing for photos with tourists, and acrobats performing death-defying stunts inches away from passing crowds. These performers are as much a part of the Times Square experience as the neon lights and towering billboards, adding a human element of creativity and talent to the commercial spectacle surrounding them. For many of these performers, the streets are their livelihood, their stage, and their chance to showcase talents that might never find a traditional venue. The best performers can earn several $100s in a good day, collecting tips from tourists impressed by their skills. But performing on city streets, surrounded by distracted crowds, hard surfaces, and urban obstacles, carries inherent risks that become magnified when the performances involve dangerous physical feats. And sometimes, in the pursuit of more impressive acts that will command larger crowds and bigger tips, these risks become deadly. Marcus Chen was a 31-year-old acrobat and street performer who had been working Times Square for nearly 5 years. Originally from California, Marcus had trained in gymnastics as a child and teenager, developing exceptional strength, balance, and body control. When a career-ending injury dashed his dreams of competitive gymnastics, he turned to street performance as a way to still use his athletic abilities and make a living doing what he loved. His act in Times Square was one of the more impressive spectacles in the area. He would perform a series of increasingly difficult acrobatic moves, building up to his signature finale, a standing backflip executed from a portable platform he set up in the plaza. Marcus was well known among the regular Times Square performers, respected for his professionalism and genuine talent. Unlike some street performers who rely on costume recognition or gimmicks, Marcus earned his tips through real athletic skill that often left crowds gasping in amazement. He had performed his backflip finale hundreds, perhaps thousands of times over the years, and it had become second nature to him, as routine as walking. But routine breeds complacency, and complacency in a dangerous activity creates the conditions for tragedy. On a busy Saturday afternoon in July, Marcus was having an excellent day. The weather was perfect, the crowds were large and generous, and he had already collected over $300 in tips by early afternoon. As he set up for what he expected to be his last performance of the day, a large crowd gathered, drawn by the upbeat music he played from a portable speaker and by the gathering of tourists already watching his warm-up routine. Marcus worked the crowd like the professional he was, joking with audience members, building anticipation, and making sure everyone had their phones out to record his spectacular finale. What Marcus didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that his portable platform, a custom-made elevated surface he used as his launching point for the backflip, had developed a structural weakness. One of the support legs had a hairline crack that had been gradually worsening over weeks of repeated impact from his landings. The platform had felt slightly less stable during his last few performances, but Marcus had attributed this to uneven ground rather than equipment failure. He had made a mental note to inspect it more carefully but hadn't gotten around to it yet. After all, the platform had never failed him before, and he had used it for years. Why would today be any different? As Marcus climbed onto the platform and raised his arms to signal the start of his finale, the crowd fell silent in anticipation. His music reached its crescendo. He bent his knees, focused his energy, and launched himself into the backflip, a move he had executed flawlessly countless times. His body rotated through the air with perfect form, the crowd already beginning to applaud. But as Marcus descended toward his landing, the platform beneath shifted. The cracked support leg, stressed beyond its capacity by his launch, finally gave way. The platform tilted at a severe angle just as Marcus's feet were about to make contact. Instead of landing squarely on the stable platform as he had done thousands of times before, Marcus's feet hit the tilted, collapsing surface at an awkward angle. His ankle twisted violently. His momentum carried him forward off the platform entirely. And in a horrifying instant, he was falling not back onto his platform but toward the hard concrete ground of the plaza with no way to control his landing. Marcus tried to adjust mid-fall, tried to get his arms in position to break his impact, but there simply wasn't enough time or space. He hit the concrete ground headfirst, his neck compressed by the force of his full body weight landing at an angle that human cervical vertebrae were never designed to withstand. The sound of the impact silenced the crowd instantly. Marcus's body went completely limp where it lay. Tourists screamed. Someone yelled for help. Several people immediately called 911 while others, including a few performers who knew CPR, rushed to Marcus's side. But even the most minimally trained observer could see that something catastrophic had happened. Marcus was unconscious, not breathing normally, and blood was beginning to pool from where his head had struck the concrete. The unnatural angle of his neck suggested severe spinal trauma. Emergency medical technicians arrived within 4 minutes, an impressively fast response time even by New York standards. They immediately stabilized Marcus's neck and began advanced life support procedures. He was rushed to Bellevue Hospital, the closest major trauma center, where a team of neurosurgeons and emergency physicians were waiting. But the damage was too severe. The impact had caused a severe fracture of Marcus's cervical spine at the C2-C3 level, essentially breaking his neck, along with massive traumatic brain injury from his skull impacting the concrete at high velocity. Despite hours of surgery and the best efforts of the medical team, Marcus never regained consciousness. He was declared brain dead the following morning, and after his family arrived from California and said their goodbyes, he was removed from life support. Marcus Chin died doing what he loved, performing for a crowd, but the tragedy was that he died from an entirely preventable equipment failure. The investigation into Marcus's death revealed that the portable platform he used was entirely his own creation, not a commercially manufactured piece of equipment that had been safety tested or certified. This isn't unusual among street performers. many of whom create custom equipment tailored to their specific acts. But while Marcus was a talented acrobat, he wasn't an engineer or structural designer. The platform's design had a fundamental weakness in how the support legs attached to the main surface, and the materials he used, while initially adequate, degraded over time with repeated stress. A professional engineer reviewing the collapsed platform after the accident calculated that it had probably been operating at the edge of failure for several weeks before finally giving way during that fatal performance. Marcus's death raised uncomfortable questions about safety regulations for street performers. Unlike formal venues where performers work under the protection of building codes, liability insurance, and safety inspections, street performers operate in a largely unregulated gray area. The city licenses them to perform and collects fees for those licenses, but there are no safety inspections of equipment, no requirements for backup plans or spotters during dangerous acts, and no oversight of the risks performers take in pursuit of tips. Marcus was essentially operating a business with significant physical risks to himself and potentially to spectators if something went wrong near the crowd, yet there was no regulatory framework ensuring that business was conducted safely. Other street performers in Times Square were devastated by Marcus's death, both personally for the loss of a friend and colleague, and professionally because it highlighted the risks they all took every day. In the weeks following the accident, several acrobatic performers quietly retired from street performance, deciding the risks weren't worth the potential rewards. Others took the opportunity to carefully inspect and upgrade their equipment, suddenly aware of how quickly years of routine success could end in disaster if they became too complacent about safety. For the tourists who witnessed Marcus's fatal fall, the experience was traumatic and created a terrible association with what should have been a fun day in New York City. Several required counseling after returning home, haunted by the memory of watching someone die in front of them while they had their phones out expecting to record entertaining content for social media. The videos some of them captured of the accident circulated online despite the family's requests that they not be shared, becoming part of the dark underbelly of the internet where tragic deaths are consumed as morbid entertainment. Marcus's family established a memorial fund in his name to provide safety equipment and training to street performers, hoping that their son's death might prevent future tragedies. They spoke about how Marcus loved performing, loved bringing joy to people, and would want his legacy to be about helping other performers stay safe rather than about fear or prohibition. It was a generous and compassionate response to an unspeakable loss, the kind of grace that emerges sometimes from grief when people try to find meaning in senseless tragedy. The spot where Marcus performed his final act became an informal memorial for a few weeks, with fellow performers leaving flowers, candles, and notes of remembrance. But in Times Square, where commercial activity never stops and new crowds arrive every day, the memorial eventually disappeared, cleaned up by sanitation workers, and the space returned to being just another section of plaza where performers set up and tourists take photos. Life in Times Square moved on, as it always does, but for those who knew Marcus Chin and for those who witnessed his death, that particular section of concrete will forever be marked by the memory of a talented performer whose final bow became his last. Food is fundamental to the Times Square experience. The area is packed with dining options ranging from fast food chains to upscale restaurants, from food carts offering hot dogs and pretzels to international cuisine representing every corner of the globe. For tourists and locals alike, grabbing a bite while exploring Times Square is as natural as breathing, a way to refuel while taking in the sights and sounds of this iconic location. Street food carts in particular are quintessentially New York, part of the cultural fabric of the city, where you can get a satisfying meal for just a few dollars while standing on a busy sidewalk watching the world go by. But on rare occasions, this most ordinary of activities, eating a meal from a street vendor, can turn deadly in ways that seem impossible until they actually happen. David Richardson was a 52-year-old tourist from Ohio visiting New York City for the first time with his wife to celebrate their 25th wedding anniversary. They had planned the trip for months, booking a hotel near Times Square so they could be in the center of all the action and easily access the theaters, restaurants, and attractions that make Manhattan a premier tourist destination. David was in good health for his age, slightly overweight but active, with no major medical conditions that gave him or his wife any concern about traveling. He was excited to experience New York, particularly the food scene he had heard so much about from friends and seen on countless television shows. On their second evening in the city, David and his wife were walking through Times Square around 7 p.m., that perfect hour when the neon lights really start to pop against the darkening sky and the crowds reach their peak density. They had dinner reservations at a theater district restaurant for 8 p.m., but David was feeling hungry and impatient. As they walked, they passed one of the many halal food carts that at the Manhattan landscape, the kind that serve gyros, chicken, rice, and falafel to late-night crowds and hungry pedestrians. The smell of grilled meat and spices wafting from the cart triggered David's appetite. Despite his wife reminding him they had reservations in an hour, David insisted on getting just a quick snack to hold him over, something small and authentically New York. He ordered a chicken kebab, a popular item consisting of marinated chicken chunks on a wooden skewer. The vendor prepared it quickly, handing the hot kebab across the cart's service window. David paid, declined the offered napkins saying he'd be fine, and he and his wife continued walking through the plaza while David began eating his kebab directly from the skewer as they walked. His wife later recalled that he was eating quickly, eager to finish before they arrived at the restaurant, and was also talking animatedly about the sights around them, pointing out billboards and commenting on the crowds, dividing his attention between his food and his surroundings. As they walked past the TKTS booth in the center of the plaza, David suddenly stopped talking mid-sentence. His wife turned to look at him and saw that his face had gone red and his hand was clutching at his throat. At first, she thought he was joking around, but within seconds it became clear something was terribly wrong. David began making choking sounds, unable to speak or breathe. His eyes went wide with panic. The chicken kebab fell from his hand, clattering onto the concrete. He had a large piece of chicken completely blocking his airway, lodged so firmly that no air could pass in either direction. David's wife began screaming for help, drawing the attention of nearby pedestrians. Several people rushed over, and someone yelled that they knew the Heimlich maneuver. A young man, a paramedic from New Jersey who happened to be in Times Square as a tourist himself, immediately positioned himself behind David and began performing abdominal thrusts, trying to generate enough force to dislodge the obstruction. But the piece of chicken was large and had been chewed inadequately before David swallowed it, becoming firmly wedged in his trachea. The Heimlich attempts weren't working. David's face was turning from red to purple as oxygen deprivation set in. He began to lose consciousness, his body going limp in the paramedic's arms. The crowd around them was enormous now, dozens of people watching in horror as this man suffocated in the middle of one of the world's most crowded public spaces. Multiple people called 911. The paramedic lowered David to the ground and began CPR, trying to keep his brain oxygenated while they waited for emergency services. But performing CPR on someone with a complete airway obstruction is nearly futile because you cannot get air into their lungs no matter how well you perform rescue breathing. The chest compressions might keep blood circulating for a short time, but without oxygen, the brain begins dying within minutes. New York City EMS arrived in approximately 3 minutes, an impressively fast response, but it had already been nearly 4 minutes since David stopped breathing. The paramedics immediately assessed the situation and attempted advanced airway management procedures. They tried to visualize the obstruction with a laryngoscope, attempted to push it down into one of the bronchi to open at least one lung, and finally had to perform an emergency cricothyrotomy, cutting directly into David's throat below the obstruction to create an alternative airway. They managed to establish an airway through this desperate procedure and began manual ventilation, but David had been without oxygen for over 6 minutes at that point. His heart had stopped. They administered emergency drugs and continued resuscitation efforts while rushing him to the nearest hospital. At the emergency department, the trauma team continued advanced life support for another 40 minutes. But David Richardson never regained consciousness or spontaneous heart rhythm. He was pronounced dead at 7:51 p.m., less than an hour after biting into that chicken kebab. The cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation due to airway obstruction, with secondary cardiac arrest from prolonged oxygen deprivation. An autopsy later revealed that the piece of chicken that killed him was approximately 2 inches in diameter, poorly chewed, and had become lodged horizontally across his trachea in such a way that it formed a complete seal, making it nearly impossible to dislodge with standard choking intervention techniques. David's wife was absolutely devastated, unable to process how a celebratory anniversary trip had ended with her husband dying on a Times Square sidewalk while dozens of strangers watched. The psychological trauma of witnessing your spouse suffocate to death is profound and long-lasting, and she required extensive therapy and support to even begin processing the experience. She later spoke to media about the incident, not to blame anyone but to raise awareness about the dangers of choking and the importance of eating mindfully rather than while distracted. Choking deaths, while relatively rare, kill approximately 5,000 Americans every year, making it a more common cause of death than many people realize. The majority of choking deaths occur in two populations: very young children who put objects in their mouths, and older adults whose swallowing reflexes have deteriorated with age. But choking can happen to anyone at any age, and it's particularly dangerous when people eat while distracted, talking, walking, or focusing on something other than their food. David had been doing all of these things simultaneously, eating while walking through a crowded, stimulating environment while talking and looking around at the sights. This divided attention likely meant he wasn't chewing his food thoroughly before swallowing, and he may have inhaled suddenly while laughing or commenting on something he saw, drawing the poorly chewed chicken into his airway instead of down his esophagus. The tragedy of David's death is amplified by how preventable it was through simple behavioral changes. If he had waited for their dinner reservation rather than eating while walking, if he had sat down somewhere to eat his kebab in a focused manner, if he had taken smaller bites and chewed more thoroughly, if he had not been talking and walking while eating, the outcome would almost certainly have been different. But these are all hindsight observations. In the moment, David was doing what millions of people do every day without consequence: grabbing street food and eating it on the go. The odds of any single instance of this behavior resulting in death are astronomically small, yet they're never quite zero, and David happened to be the unlucky one. The food cart vendor was interviewed by police and health inspectors as part of the investigation, but no fault was found with the food or its preparation. The chicken was properly cooked, handled safely, and the vendor had all appropriate licenses and health certifications. This wasn't a case of food poisoning or contamination, just a tragic instance of a normal piece of food becoming lodged in the wrong place. The vendor, an immigrant from Pakistan who had been operating his cart for over a decade, was reportedly traumatized by having witnessed someone die after eating his food, even though he bore no responsibility for what happened. The young paramedic who first attempted the Heimlich maneuver on David struggled with guilt afterwards, wondering if there was something more he could have done or if he had performed the technique incorrectly. Medical professionals who reviewed the case assured him that he had done everything right, that the obstruction was simply too large and too firmly lodged for the Heimlich to work, and that no one could have saved David without immediate surgical intervention to create an alternative airway. But survivor's guilt doesn't respond to logical assurances, and the paramedic reportedly sought counseling to process the experience of watching someone die despite his best efforts to help. David Richardson's death certificate lists asphyxiation due to airway obstruction as the cause of death, and accidental as the manner of death. These clinical terms capture what happened but not what it meant. A man celebrating his 25th anniversary with his wife, excited to experience New York City, with a full life ahead of him, dying suddenly over a simple street food purchase. His family held his funeral in Ohio, where friends and relatives struggled to understand how a healthy man could leave for a vacation and return in a casket. The anniversary trip that was supposed to create joyful memories instead became a nightmare that David's wife would spend the rest of her life trying to process and heal from. Times Square continued its relentless activity, unaware and uncaring that it had been the site of yet another tragedy. The food carts continued serving thousands of customers daily. Tourists continued eating while walking, talking, and taking photos. And the odds remained astronomically small but never quite zero that any one of them might be the next person for whom an everyday activity becomes the last thing they ever do. David Richardson's death serves as a sobering reminder that danger doesn't always announce itself with warning signs and obvious risks. Sometimes the most mundane, ordinary activities we engage in without a second thought are the ones that end our lives, catching us completely unaware until it's far too late to do anything about it. Times Square, the crossroads of the world, the place where millions come to celebrate life, had claimed another victim engaged in the most human of activities, simply trying to enjoy a meal.